But because these are being recorded, we're still going to go through and do a presentation. And what we're going to do, Dr. Jane Kim and I are going to talk a little bit, and Vanessa's also here, and Rajitha Bhatt, who some of you met in the motor testing room, is another child neurologist, might pop in, and Carice Stevens is here, who's the clinic coordinator for the UCLA clinic. But what we thought we'd do, it's not a long presentation, is just quickly take you through the basic framework of the National DUP15Q clinics, and then talk to you a little bit about the database, and then open it up for questions. I actually have a few questions for you guys in terms of what you would find helpful as we continue to build the clinics and their programs. So this is like much more interactive, so please chime in. And hopefully we'll be done earlier than 5, because I know everyone wants to, I don't know, go to the beach or happy hour. You are going to the beach? Oh, amazing. I'm gonna come. Okay, so the goals of the clinic, sorry, this font is smaller than I wanted it to be, but so there's some sort of primary goals of the DUP15Q national clinics, and I'll show you where those are, meaning where the clinics are. But the goals are, first, that we want to have one place to provide multidisciplinary care of patients with DUP15Q syndrome. We want the clinics to be able to provide guidance for families regarding diagnosis, prognosis, clinical monitoring, and treatment. Oftentimes families are diagnosed, by clinicians who are not quite sure what the diagnosis even means, and so we want to have a home where we can provide you with all the guidance that you need. We also would like to provide the necessary resources for parents through the Alliance. So we partner with the Alliance to help give whatever resources you need in terms of information or referral ideas, that kind of thing. Eventually, we'd like to actually start developing some best practice guidelines based on our clinical experience and studies. And so you've heard me today talk about a couple of things like 24-hour EEGs at baseline, and that's kind of a soft recommendation that we've come up with, but we'd like to kind of put some of those out there, and some will probably be based on data from all the clinics, and some will be actually based on really just sort of our sense of what clinical best practices should be for these kids. We'd also like to link families directly to research opportunities, both locally and nationally, because as you've seen probably over the course of the last couple of days, there's a lot of exciting research happening in DUP15Q and in related conditions. And so we'd like you to be able to, when you come to a clinic like one of ours, not only get good clinical care, but actually know what's available from a research perspective, because that can also benefit you and your family. And then finally, when we see kids in clinic, and I'll show you kind of the flow, we have a central registry where all of the clinical data are entered in a de-identified manner, which then facilitates larger scale studies, kind of like what we're doing here and what you've heard us talk about already from a research standpoint. Okay, so where are the clinics? And I think this number will continue to grow. And this does not mean, before I list them, that other providers around the country don't know anything about DUP15Q. This is just the clinics that are kind of endorsed by the Alliance, and it's a group of folks that communicate with each other about clinical care for kids with DUP15Q. So those are in Boston, Geisinger, which is in Pennsylvania, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, UCLA, New York, Miami, St. Paul, Minnesota, and then UCSF, or San Francisco. And this is just a nice map schematic, so you will see that there is a large part of the country that is not represented, namely the middle. So that is, that's a work in progress. And again, there are people like Ed Cook, who's at University of Chicago, has a tremendous expertise. One of the first people who ever wrote about DUP15Q 20 years ago and its association with autism. So there's some really well-informed folks around the country, who just don't run a national clinic because they don't have the infrastructure set up yet. Okay, so we did some polling of the clinics thus far, just to give you guys a sense of what they're seeing. Some of the missing pieces are just because we didn't get all the information. It's not because it doesn't exist. But and we're going to do a better job over the next year, I think, more comprehensively polling the clinics in terms of getting an idea from them of what they're seeing. Boston has been around the longest. They've been seeing patients since 2009. We've been seeing patients since 2014 and a half, like 14, 15. Minnesota's been seeing patients for also, I think, 3 years. Geisinger has been seeing families for quite some time too, I think around 2010, 2011. UCSF is very new. So the total number of kids seen you see here, there's a big range. Most of us are seeing more IDICs than interstitials, but that is, of course, that's not that much of a surprise. The one exception is, that's not listed here, is Memphis, because they had a big interstitial research program. It wasn't a clinic per se, in that there wasn't sort of primary clinical care. A lot of the assessments were done under the umbrella of research, but they've definitely seen the most kids with interstitial duplications. We're seeing a range of ages, but I would say the theme here is that we're all starting to see more adults. So, meaning not more than kids, but that we're seeing an increasing number of adults with DUP15Q. And the clinics most of the clinics are run by neurologists. And as child neurologists, we're actually board certified in child and adult neurology. So we actually can take care of adults. And my clinic, in fact, not just DUP15, but in general, about 50% of my patients are over the age of 18. They all have profound developmental disabilities. But so many of us do see those older individuals also. And I think that's a theme that we're going to have to think about when we think about resources for those kids, or adults, I should say. We asked what the primary referrals were, meaning who are you sending kids to? And part of this depends on who the person is who is sending the kids to, in the sense that if neurology and epilepsy are the primary person in the clinic, then they're going to be referring to, non-epilepsy folks because they're already doing the epilepsy. So it depends a little bit. But GI was the number one referral for all of us, meaning that was the one specialty that we're all referring out. Psychiatry was another big referral in our clinic, which I'll get to. We actually have, I wrote psychiatry, but actually we have psychiatry in our clinic, so we don't actually refer out to psychiatry. Some clinics don't have genetics in their clinic, so they're referring out to genetics. Developmental peds services like PTOT were the other ones that people responded to. And as you'll see, in terms of specialty, what this means is what is the primary specialty of the primary clinician in the clinic. You'll see it's mostly neurology except for Geisinger, where it's run by genetics. Okay, so we just put this together in terms of basics. So the question we were getting asked was, what if I'm not in one of those cities and I would like to be seen in a clinic? And I will have Vanessa weigh in on this more. I'll just run through it really quickly. So the first thing is, if you go to the website, I just did a little snapshot, which you cannot see at all, so it's completely unhelpful. But if you go to the DUP15Q website, if you go to the clinics tab, there is the list of each of the clinics, and there's a phone number for the coordinator for each of the clinics. And that's an updated phone number, and the person you will call knows what they're talking about, and they can actually help guide you through the process of coming in to be seen in that clinic. So the clinic you choose should be based on where you live and what's closer. Maybe if some people have family in certain areas and they can go visit, whatever it might be. But once you choose a clinic, then if you call the clinic coordinator, they can actually look into things like insurance authorization, help you with travel arrangements, meaning telling you about, hotels and other things that are nearby. And then what we ask is that when you call the clinic coordinator, that you have a general sense of what your primary goals are for the clinic visit. And if it's just, I want to see everyone and I want a big multidisciplinary assessment, that's okay. But as I showed in the last slide, some clinics don't have all the specialties in the clinic itself. And so if you are calling and saying, I really need psychiatry because my child has behavioral issues, but you're going to Geisinger where it's primarily genetics, they may say, well, we can either bring in a specialist for that, or maybe we're not the right clinic to come to if that's your primary issue. But sometimes patients call us and they just want a specialist to just give them a general sense of the diagnosis and prognosis, all the things that we've been talking about in this conference. And if that's the case, any of the clinics are fine for that. But it's a good idea to kind of have that information ahead of time. Oh, and then the coordinator will gather all your prior records before you come so that the clinicians can review it. Because again, we do see kids from, all of us in our different clinics see kids from all over. It's hard because we also often interact with parents over email. Parents will just email us with questions because they found us on the website. And we try really hard to not give clinical advice over email because we just haven't seen your child and it's hard. And I don't, even though we want to help as much as possible, it's very hard to give recommendations on medications or, anything for that matter without having seen the child and done a proper evaluation. Okay, so I thought I'd quickly just show you the pipeline of our clinic at UCLA, just as an example. So our clinic is actually under the umbrella of a larger program called the Developmental Neurogenetics Clinic, which again, Crease is the coordinator of. And so what happens is, and there's Crease, didn't know that was going to happen, right? So I know. So what happens is people will call in to the coordinator, and there'll be some basic history taken over the phone just to get a sense of what the main needs are for the patient. We just started, and I don't have a slide on it, but we just started a process of we developed a questionnaire that we're calling the diagnostic journey, and it's basically interviewing parents about their diagnostic journey around both the genetic diagnosis and the neurodevelopmental diagnosis. Because it used to be that it was that kids had a neurodevelopmental diagnosis, maybe autism, maybe global delay, and then the genetic diagnosis happened. And then there was sort of that. Now we're seeing actually some kids get genetic testing done really early. And the reason we're asking those questions is that we are really interested in kind of understanding what's the process of getting diagnosed and what's it like after you get diagnosed. How does it impact your service provision? What are the major gaps in the process, right? Because we're seeing a lot of kids or families who are given a diagnosis and then they're kind of left out into the wilderness without really knowing what to do next. And so we have this interview that we developed based on a lot of validated questionnaires, and we've been calling, parents are doing it over the phone before they come in, and it's really been helpful. We're definitely going to publish it once we get more numbers. And then Crease also gets all the prior records. Why isn't this moving? Oh no, oh, that's a bummer. Wait. Pretend you didn't see all that animation. Okay, so then they come in, and our clinic happens to have these specialties. So we have genetics, and Julian Martinez is our geneticist. He's incredible. He's like an encyclopedia of genetics, and he will see every patient. They see psychiatry if needed. The little ones don't need psychiatry, but sometimes if there's psychopharm issues or behavioral issues, it's helpful to have them there. So Erin Besterman is our psychiatrist. They see neurology. They either see myself or Dr. Bott or both of us together. She's doing the motor assessments today. You've probably met her. We also have psychology in our clinic, and they do, and that's actually a newer addition. And this is Charlotte, who actually you've seen doing the testing. So she has done a lot of work with minimally verbal kids, and so if we need her, she'll do consults around augmentative communication systems and language intervention and that sort of thing. And then we very recently added a social worker, Kyle Cassidy, who helps with resources, helping parents navigate the whole issue of IEPs in the school system and getting services and all those things, which is difficult anywhere. In LA, it seems like it's particularly challenging. So that's been a great addition. So our clinic had started with just genetics, neurology, psychiatry, and adding in those pieces has really been helpful. And then after they're seen, so we do the clinical eval, we do a report, we feed back to the family, we do all the clinical care that's needed. And then we actually automatically, kids get, or the families are given an opportunity to be involved in 2 studies. So one is the Be Big study, which actually was in part done today, with the testing. So at UCLA, any child who's seen in the DNG clinic if they're interested, can be a part of that study. So they come to our lab and we do developmental testing and EEG. And then everyone also gets consented to have their data, their clinical data, be stored in the DUP15Q Alliance database. And so that's kind of the pipeline. So the nice thing about that is that you're seen clinically, you have clinical care done, but then you're automatically given an opportunity to be involved in research. And I imagine that those studies will grow over time. Okay, so what's unique about the UCLA clinic is that, and I only bring this up because, and again, there's uniqueness about every one of the clinics. The key with ours is that it's centered in CART, which is a Center for Autism Research and Treatment. So our primary department is psychiatry. So we're in an autism center. And so we are very lucky because we have tons of autism experts all around us. We do, I'm a neurologist, Dr. Bott's a neurologist, we manage the epilepsy, but we are not primarily epileptologists in the sense that our primary expertise is in neurodevelopment. And so we do end up seeing a lot of kids that come from all over the country where the question is, what is my child's developmental profile? What are the issues? What do you recommend for intervention? That kind of thing, which is why our epilepsy numbers are a little bit lower. Like we happen to see a lot of kids, even with IDIC, who don't have seizures because they're coming specifically for different questions. And that's different than Dr. Tibbert's clinic in Boston, which is very epilepsy heavy. And so he sees all the really complicated epilepsies and doesn't really have a lot of focus on the autism developmental delay piece. So the percent of kids he sees with epilepsy is like 95%, whereas ours is like 60%. And that's just because of the kind of referrals we're getting. And then the other kind of unique elements, I talked about the diagnostic journey interview. We're also the AAC I talked about. The other thing we're doing with our social worker now is developing a resource database for families so that we can start having in the Southern California area a database where we can query to help people with resources, meaning I live in X area and I really need a good physical therapist. Could you give me some names? We're kind of building a resource database for that because it's a really difficult kind of system to navigate otherwise. Okay, so these are the observations I have made from my clinical experience in the last 3 years. One is that diagnoses are being made much, much earlier, like even in the last 3 years. When I say diagnoses, I mean genetics diagnoses. So we had a patient who was diagnosed in the NICU because she had poor feeding and an astute clinician thought that her tone was low, so they got a microarray. So I bring that up because we're seeing kids now who are diagnosed well before any of the sequelae of DUP15Q have happened. And that's actually really important when we think about, again, early interventions and even thinking about, how do we guide families on monitoring when we actually don't know at that point, will they develop seizures, will they have developmental delays, that sort of thing. So that's something we're thinking a lot about, but we are seeing kids much younger. I'm getting asked, and this is true with all of us, lots of questions about alternative therapies, especially for epilepsy, like CBD. And there's a lot of folks who are coming in already taking a lot of alternative treatments. And I think as a clinics group, we need to be thinking more about how to gather some data on that, I think, and give some, consistent guidance. I'm also finding, and maybe you guys in the room agree, that despite the fact that many of our children are minimally verbal, that it is very hard for families to get access to augmentative communication systems. So I've had so many families say, my child doesn't talk, the speech therapist said that iPad's not gonna work, because he or she has motor issues, and so we don't even have access to it. And so I see children who are 6, 7, 8 who have no means of communication. That is a major problem. So that's something that we need to, I think, focus on. I've also been seeing some challenges around obtaining resources because there's a genetic diagnosis. And I brought this up in my autism talk earlier, this kind of complete misconception that because it's DUP15Q, it's not autism. Or because it's DUP15Q, one cannot make gains with interventions for autism, which is a lie. And so we do a lot of work around writing appropriate letters for families to make sure that they get the services they need. And then more recently, so I said we're diagnosing much earlier, but we're also seeing a lot of adults at the other end who are, have had a diagnosis for quite some time, and this issue about transitioning to adulthood. And I know you guys had a session on that about thinking about conservatorship and just planning for the future. We're having a lot more dialogues about that, and those dialogues are supposed to start happening at age 12 and 13, and they're not, and we're often seeing them in the clinic by they're 18 and 19, and the conversations haven't happened yet. And so that's something that we, I think, as a clinics group, to be more proactive about having information maybe on the website about. Okay, I'm not going to do that. Okay, so these are the questions for you. Do you want to first talk about the database, Jane, and then we'll do questions? Quickly? Okay, and then we'll have questions, then we're done. So.
Perfect. All right. I just want to go back to one thing that Shefali had mentioned about how certain clinics may be more equipped to deal with certain issues, like the UCLA clinic is great for autism and behavioral issues, and the Boston clinic might be better for epilepsy. So if you have questions about which clinic might be best for you, you can contact me or Vanessa, and we can help direct you to the clinic that may be best suited for your needs, so that so it's a productive visit. I'm going to talk really briefly about the clinic's database. So a few years ago, the DUP15Q Alliance provided funding for a database where all the clinics can share information. And with the rare disorder, it's really helpful to be able to pool all of our information so that we can get more meaningful data. And so if you come to a DUP15Q clinic, you may be told about the database, and participation is voluntary, and you sign an informed consent for it. And so there are certain questionnaires that go into a REDCap database, which is a secure database that houses all the information so that we can all share our data, and it's been really helpful to gain more information. And I think that's about it as far as the database. So we can move on to the questions.
Okay. And we listened to all of them. We didn't implement all of them yet because we didn't have quite the systems in place, and now that we have. Vanessa and we're building again. We'll have more clinics. I think we can really address some of the needs. But these are some of the questions I had for all of you. I know you're tired at the end of the day. So, but the first one is, what would you say are your primary unmet needs? Meaning, and along those lines is kind of bullet point number 3, which is what resources could a clinic provide to you that it's not right now or that your clinician right now is not? So you can chime in how you want. And actually, before I even ask that, how many of you are actually in an area where there actually is a DUP15Q clinic? Can I ask which ones? So where? Seattle, okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes. So, okay, so that's great. So there's, so most of you are not near clinics, I would say. So what would you say, maybe I'll ask the guys who actually are near clinics, what you would say are the things that you would like to see happen that aren't happening, or?
That's a hard question for me because we're having a lot of problems with this.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Complicated answer.
Okay.
Maybe more suited for.
Okay. Then how about at UCSF? Have you already accessed the clinic?
Yeah, and I feel like it's just being a regular neurologist, there's nothing much more from that clinic. I would want to see the autism and behavior piece also and the social work piece.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have a lot of supervision, it looks like right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it was relatively new. So,
Yeah, that's true. No, they're very new actually, but they're very good, and they have a lot of experience with.
they helped us with the epilepsy part, just continue monitoring it. But my daughter also has some, gait issues, so recently it was nice to, refer us to some type of orthotics or, therapy or something like that. So yeah, it would be great if all the clinics shared information and all the pieces that, UCLA has, can, represent to the UCSF clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I could also come down here and go to your clinic for that piece. So
Right. Well, I would love to, our goal is not to have everyone have to travel. Like, we have no, it would be much better to have it be done locally. And I would say that clinic, that model has taken 3 years to build, and it's not just DUP15Q, so that's the whole developmental neurogenetics clinic. So I started that clinic because I was seeing more and more kids in my regular clinic who had autism and had a new genetic diagnosis and had no idea where to go. And so I roped in Julie and Martinez, and I said, we got to start seeing kids together because we have to give them some guidance. And so it was the two of us. And then it gained traction, and all these families were saying, this is so valuable. So we basically went to the institution and said, we need some support. We'll get bigger support through donors and grants and all that later, but if you can just give us some basic support for that clinic, that would be helpful. And that's when we were able to bring in some time of a psychiatrist. We brought in a clinic coordinator, which makes a world of difference because it just organizes things. And then most recently, as of 6 months ago, I got funding for the social worker and now for Charlotte to do the intervention piece. So it's building slowly. But I agree that I think it would be ideal that all the clinics had similar structures. It's just always hard, it's hard. So then it may be that we do need to we have clinics that have certain areas of expertise, and we provide opportunities for families to come down. We see a lot of Bay Area families actually, not on a regular basis, but at least once or twice for an evaluation. So we can certainly facilitate that if it's needed. What else? Yeah. Yeah.
We were going to the clinic in Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah.
And my daughter got there by all the different doctors. Then the clinic just shut down from one day to the next. And so we were left, we called, and there was no information anymore about anything. So, we did go to the Red Cap, I think, but what do we do? Where do we go from there?
Yeah.
How does the information gets transferred or?
So the Memphis clinic closed, I don't know if it was last year or the year before that, because the neurologist who was heading the clinic left University of Tennessee, and so she was the main person heading the clinic, and we really needed a neurologist or a clinician who could kind of head the clinic, and so for that reason the clinic closed. The information that's in REDCap is still in REDCap and is still valuable to us. You can still request your medical records, and you're welcome to go to any of the other DUP15Q clinics or just stick with your regular neurologist, whatever you need. But you can always take the records and all the documentation that was done during your visits there and take it with you.
If I want to go some, let's say to LA, here, and could I do everything again, or would I be able to do that, or because we never got any of the information really, so that's.
Yeah, you probably have whole nother evaluation done and go through the whole process again. And with each of these visits, a lot of the evaluations are done over and over time to measure for growth and development. And so, and you should be able to request those records. Yeah.
And I think one thing that came up 2 years ago that is confusing, definitely, is sort of what is clinical and what's research. And so, there's basic clinical care that all the clinics give, and that is just based on physicians seeing your child and giving recommendations. The part that gets tricky is the whole assessment piece, meaning, so for instance, you went to the Memphis clinic that your child probably had, like an ADOS and cognitive testing and all of that, which really was done under a research umbrella. What we try to do in general in clinical care is that, to do those assessments as clinical assessments, meaning that you get billed for them, right, is actually really hard. And most clinics, if they do those sorts of assessments for clinical purposes, charge a fee for service. There's no insurance coverage for going into a clinic and getting an ADOS and like all the stuff that's happening here. To do that clinically at UCLA costs thousands of dollars. And so what we do is we try to have research opportunities that then, as a secondary benefit to you, is that you get some results back that you can use for services and everything else. And we just make it very clear this was a research assessment done by clinicians, and that this is these are the findings, if you will. So for instance, in our clinic, we don't standardly in the clinic have a Mullen and an ADOS and all those things. That's not part of the standard clinical evaluation. If someone wants to pay for that to happen, our clinic does it. I mean, we have a whole half of our clinic that just is focused on that. However, instead, what we do is we offer another opportunity, which is that we have a big NIH-funded study. That's the BBIG study. It's now also partly funded by Roche for the work we're doing in DUP15, but in that study, what we're asking is what are the specific developmental profiles of kids with genetic syndromes and neurodevelopmental conditions. So we do a lot of developmental testing and EEG. So in that study, so you come to the clinic, you get referred if you're interested in the study, all the testing gets done through the study, so you're not paying for it because it's a study. You get a report out of that, which is hopefully of benefit to you if the results are helpful, and all the data still get entered into that same database. And so the field is moving more and more towards doing that because doing clinical assessments is really difficult. There often isn't a lot of expertise and it's just expensive. And so if we do it under the umbrella of research where we can really use that information to help us understand these kids, then we can kind of kill two birds, with one stone in some ways. So.
Are all the clinics doing this research? Or no? I think my son may have spoken with you because my grandson is interstitial, but has seizure problems because he also has P&G. So, because of the episode, we're in Salt Lake City, do we go to Boston? And then Boston, are they a part of the research team? So this other testing is going to be really important because that's what I see missing is for information to give to early intervention, to understand what's happening in the brain so these practitioners can make a difference.
Yeah, so there are, I would say that it depends on the site. Boston and Geisinger both have quite a few research studies that are ongoing as well. And we would like at some point to have and I think with the natural history study, which we really hope will be launched in the next year. Okay, yeah, so Vanessa's going to talk about it a little bit tomorrow, but we're really trying to pull together, and this was sort of the first step to that, a lot of the work we've been doing here. But once we have a natural history study, then yes, there will be consistent collection of clinical information across the sites, and actually people who aren't at the sites will be able to provide a lot of information through questionnaires and other things that they can get we'll hopefully have, we're going to work on having a way that you get feedback on the results of those once they're scored and other things. So the goal would be, to have that happen at every site, which is, there's some rare conditions where that is exactly the system in place, where this is a newer process with DUP15, but I think we'll get there. And I think Boston, Geisinger, and UCLA probably are the closest to being kind of consistent, and maybe Minnesota. Yeah, as well.
Yeah. And, just real quickly, we've been having discussions about whether it's more beneficial to have more clinics, and so people have to travel less, versus having less clinics, but really focusing more on standardized care, and that, all the therapy, everything is in place. So it's been a struggle to balance the two. And, if you have input on that, we'd appreciate it too. Whether you'd rather travel more and maybe get more of the services that you need in one place, versus somewhere that's easier for you to get to. I mean, which is more important?
That's a good question. So some of the things we listed on the bottom were specific questions that we had for you. And I think so would it be helpful, and this was something that came up a couple of years ago actually at the meeting, would it be helpful to have some kind of document about either, tell me, is DUP15Q as a whole, about, DUP15Q development, seizures, whatever it might be, that you could provide to your primary care, or having them have a link to the website where they could access information about Would that be something for, especially those of you who aren't near a national clinic, would that be helpful?